President Trump's declaration on Venezuelan airspace and the global reaction today. One of the most widely discussed stories in international politics revolves around a sudden and highly charged announcement made by United States President Donald Trump. In a statement released through his official social media channels, President Trump declared that Venezuelan airspace, and the airspace surrounding it, is closed in its entirety. The announcement immediately triggered diplomatic shockwaves across the Americas and well beyond, sparking debates in political, legal, and aviation circles. In this report, we look at the background, the reactions, the potential consequences, and the broader geopolitical context surrounding this fast-developing situation. To begin, let's look at the exact nature of Trump's declaration. In his message, he stated, "The airspace above and surrounding Venezuela is now closed in its entirety." This is a clear warning to all airlines, all pilots, and to drug and human traffickers. The wording was unusually strong, and the timing particularly striking. Within minutes, news networks began analyzing the statement, international agencies issued preliminary responses, and governments around the region began assessing possible implications. Why did Trump make this declaration? According to the administration's explanation, the purpose is to curb illegal drug trafficking, to restrict transnational criminal operations, and to exert stronger pressure on the government of President Nicolas Maduro. Washington has long accused the Maduro administration of ties to organized crime, corruption, and political repression. The closure of airspace, even symbolically, fits into a broader, long-standing U.S. policy of isolating the Venezuelan government and weakening its ability to operate internationally. Venezuela's response, however, came quickly and forcefully. The country's Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued an official statement calling Trump's announcement an unacceptable act of colonialist intimidation. According to the Venezuelan government, no foreign power has the authority to unilaterally define or control the nation's airspace. The statement went on to accuse the United States of violating international norms, attempting to destabilize the region, and interfering in the sovereign affairs of an independent state. President Maduro himself delivered a televised speech shortly afterward. In his address, he rejected the announcement as a hostile and absurd provocation. Maduro declared that only the Venezuelan government can determine the status of Venezuelan airspace, and he described the U.S. message as an attempt to impose external control on Latin American nations. In his words, "No one in Washington can decide who flies over Venezuela. This is our sky, and we will defend it." Meanwhile, regional governments began issuing cautious reactions. Several Latin American nations, including Colombia, Brazil, and Argentina, avoided taking a direct stance but emphasized the importance of respecting international aviation protocols. Under global aviation law, the power to regulate airspace belongs exclusively to the sovereign state in question. The Chicago Convention on International Civil Aviation, which defines the rules of airspace, makes it clear that no government can unilaterally declare another nation's airspace closed. Therefore, Trump's statement does not legally change the status of Venezuelan skies. Instead, it serves as a political signal and a form of diplomatic pressure. Nevertheless, the announcement has already affected global flight operations. A number of major airlines, especially those flying transatlantic routes between Europe and South America, began reviewing their flight paths. Some have opted to reroute flights around Venezuelan territory as a precautionary measure. Airline safety departments typically adjust routes when there is uncertainty or increased geopolitical tension, even if the threat is symbolic or primarily political. The potential risk, however small, is enough for airlines to avoid controversy and ensure passenger safety. The next question concerns the legal and geopolitical interpretation of the situation. International law experts stress that Trump's declaration does not carry legal authority over foreign airspace, but they also note that such announcements can influence diplomatic behavior and aviation practices. In global politics, statements by powerful nations can have practical consequences even when they lack legal force. And in this case, the U.S. is clearly signaling its intention to tighten its stance against the Maduro government. Economically, the situation adds new stress to an already fragile Venezuelan economy. For years, Venezuela has suffered from hyperinflation, currency collapse, food shortages, and declining oil production. The country's oil sector, which provides almost all of its export revenue, is highly sensitive to geopolitical instability. Any additional tension involving the U.S. tends to impact oil markets, and analysts are watching closely to see whether this incident will affect global oil prices or investor confidence. At the same time, several international actors have stepped into the discussion. Russia and China, two of Venezuela's most important political and economic partners, criticized the U.S. statement. The Russian Foreign Ministry described the announcement as an unacceptable attempt to impose unilateral control over a sovereign nation. Russia has long supported the Maduro government, including through energy partnerships and security cooperation. China, on the other hand, issued a more measured response. While avoiding direct criticism of Washington, Beijing reaffirmed the importance of respecting the sovereignty of all nations. China's more cautious tone reflects its significant financial investments in Venezuela, including major loans and infrastructure projects. Beyond the geopolitical maneuvering, there is also a humanitarian dimension. The Venezuelan population has endured years of economic decline, shortages of essential goods, and political turmoil. Aid organizations warn that any escalation of political tensions can worsen the living conditions of ordinary citizens. Increased sanctions, economic pressure, or transportation disruptions could undermine access to food, medicine, and basic services. Experts in international relations predict that the situation could mark the beginning of a larger regional power struggle. The United States is clearly aiming to reassert its influence in Latin America after years of shifting global dynamics. Meanwhile, Russia and China are working to maintain or expand their presence in the region through political alliances, economic investments, and strategic partnerships. Venezuela, caught between these competing forces, is trying to preserve its sovereignty while navigating a complex and highly polarized geopolitical environment. For now, the reality is that the airspace is not legally closed, and flights can still operate normally unless the Venezuelan government itself decides otherwise. However, Trump's statement has introduced a new layer of uncertainty, and uncertainty is often enough to create ripple effects across diplomacy, aviation, and economics. Regional governments are monitoring the situation closely, and international organizations may step in if tensions escalate. The key question going forward is whether the two sides will de-escalate through diplomatic channels or whether this episode represents the early stages of a broader confrontation. If diplomatic engagement fails, the consequences could extend far beyond aviation. There could be increased sanctions, retaliatory political measures, or even disruptions in trade and energy markets. In summary, President Trump's declaration is not legally binding but is politically significant. Venezuela's response has been swift and aggressive, framing the statement as an attack on national sovereignty. Regional governments are cautious, airlines are adjusting flight paths, and global powers are positioning themselves strategically. The situation remains fluid, and the coming days will likely determine whether the announcement becomes a brief diplomatic controversy or the opening chapter in a much larger geopolitical